Okay, so I will admit I'm not completely out of the woods when it comes to chronic fatigue syndrome. However, years ago I experienced tremendous pain. I was bedbound. I needed help having a bath. I needed help preparing all of my food. I needed help going to the toilet. I needed help with all of these things. And I've gone from that point to being fairly more independent over the span of a few years. However, there are some things that have really worked for me, and it's allowed me to have more independence, to be on my feet more in a day, to experience less pain, to be more social with people, to go out on walks and cycle rides. And I think what I'm going to explain to you guys in today's video is really going to help you to get from that bedbound point to a point where you may be allowed to have a little bit more freedom with everyday life. So the label of CFS is incredibly vague and a number of symptoms can be attached to it. But one thing that's apparent is that there are tons of people who suffer with severe fatigue, some much worse than others. Now to me, it's less of a diagnosis and more of a physiological state that one's body becomes accustomed to, perhaps following a noticeable event, for example a trauma, a virus, adverse reactions to medications or immunizations, or maybe just pushing the body too hard and stressing too much. And some of the symptoms you might hear people with CFS regularly experience include things like irritability, pain, severe fatigue, orthostatic intolerance, lightheadedness, temperature dysregulation, gastrointestinal upset, just overall head tension or hypersensitivity to your surrounding environment, so you can't stand lights or certain sounds. But one question I think is really important to address is CFS a stressed state or a post-stress state? And one line you'll hear all the time from people in the CFS online community is that you need to get your body out of a sympathetic fight or flight state and into that parasympathetic rest and digest state. And with this, some of the most common approaches I hear people recommend when it comes to CFS include neural retraining, mindfulness, meditation, attending retreats, doing detox therapies, taking supplements, changing your diet, doing breathing exercises, and making more time for yourself. But if I was to suggest that chronic fatigue syndrome was a post-stress state as opposed to a stress state, what are some of the signs and symptoms we could look out for? What are some of the tests we could have done that could potentially point us in this direction? Well, one test I've had on a couple of occasions is a hair mineral analysis test. And on both occasions, it came back with a low sodium to potassium ratio. And you guys can see from this table in front of you here how having that low sodium to potassium ratio tends to be where more chronic stress comes in, more frustration, resentment, hostility, less reactive tissue, and towards the later stages of fatigue and exhaustion. Whereas you look on the column on the left hand side, and this is where a lot of people will tell you about being in a stressed state, there's a greater tendency of inflammation, and you're more in that acute stress phase where you feel more anger and rage and you have more energy to actually express. Whereas from my experience, speaking with people with chronic fatigue syndrome and seeing them online, they're more anxious, they're more secluded, they're more to themselves. And another interesting point from drwilson.com, which is all about hair mineral analysis, is that among the adrenal hormones, sodium is more associated with aldosterone, a pro-inflammatory hormone, while potassium is more related to cortisol, which is an anti-inflammatory hormone involved in the breakdown of tissues and joints. And that leads me on to this next point, which is CFS. Could its onset be due to an immune challenge? Many people who've ended up with CFS tend to have one similar thing in common. They experienced either a prolonged period of physical or emotional stress, an unexpected trauma, a viral infection, or had an adverse reaction to medications or immunizations. And following on from the previous slide, all of the above are situations that are capable of producing very similar physiological effects in the body. And interestingly enough, one of the main ones being to raise levels of the stress hormone cortisol and create a weaker and more vulnerable immune system. And this is a situation I see go on all the time with CFS sufferers. Yes, they're often bedbound and extremely fatigued, but they also suffer with pain and immune challenges like picking up frequent colds and flus. And one big factor all of these things have in common with one another typically is raised cortisol levels. So here are just some symptoms linked to low sodium and high cortisol levels. So on the low sodium column, we've got low resistance or resilience to any forms of stress, anxiety, withdrawal, weakness or lethargy, dry skin, fatigue, constipation, low blood pressure, and allergies. And then when it comes to high cortisol symptoms, there's heightened anxiety, lowered immune responses, irritable bowel syndrome, low reproductive drive, a high susceptibility to illness, of course that's with a weakened immune system, more fatigue, especially mental fatigue, irritability, joint, muscle pain, and also low blood pressure. But what about the nervous system? Because this is something that I hear lots of people suggest you implement certain tactics into your everyday life to try to get your body into that parasympathetic rest and digest system. One thing I would really question about a lot of the tactics these people propose is there really any longevity to some of the activities people are attempting to do to try to fix their bodies? And that really brings me on to the point, which is, have approaches you've attempted in the past to try and heal your body had lasting results, or does your body tend to regress back to how it was previously? Now, I definitely agree that the brain and nervous system play a huge role in the balance of various hormonal levels, immune markers, electrolyte levels, and I do believe it's important to observe in the case of people with CFS. I just wonder about some of the methods people are suggesting to try to get your body back to what it was. Like I said before, does it have longevity? Do we need to look elsewhere? Now, one thing a lot of people fail to recognize is the fact that the body's sympathetic nervous system is extremely important, and it's involved in far more than just the stress response. So you get people all the time talking about the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight or freeze system, where your body's blood pressure raises, it shuts down digestion, your heart rate raises, and you get all these anxious type symptoms, lots of sweating, pupil dilation, and they talk about sympathetic nervous system in a bad light. But the fact is, the sympathetic nervous system is involved in a lot of bodily processes to keep us at normal homeostatic levels on a day-to-day basis. And just one example of that is that blood vessels around the entire body are controlled by the sympathetics. So that means that constriction and dilation of these blood vessels is under sympathetic control. And so in order for renewed and oxygenated blood to be mobilized efficiently around the entirety of the body and delivered to a certain tissue, cell or organ, it requires adequate sympathetic innervation. And a lack of sympathetics can contribute to fatigue due to an all-round decreased energy metabolism, which is something I'm going to get onto in the next slide. So next up is all about deconditioning, and this is a phenomenon that when we spend extended periods of time at bed rest, or we spend extended periods of time without mobilizing or using our muscles at all, then there are lots of physiological effects that happen within the body, and the majority of these actually slow down the energy production within the body. So as you guys can see on this table in front of you, if we're exposed to a 0G environment, that's also bed rest, for an extended period of time, we're going to have a decrease in our musculoskeletal mass, also a decrease in our plasma volume, red blood cell production, cardiovascular reflexes, energy metabolism, and sympathetic activity. So if you observe some of these factors closely, you can really start to see how deconditioning may not be the onset, it may not be the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, but if you're somebody who's ended up in a situation where you've been bedbound for an extended period of time, that might be weeks, months, or even years, it can really have a drastic impact on the quality of your life and your ability to actually deal with everyday stressors like gravity, for example, or just moving around or having the energy to carry out every day-to-day activities. And another important thing this tells me is the fact that you can't just supplement energy. You can't just take a pill, supplement, change a food up in your diet and expect to have loads of energy, especially if this is your current situation. These are things that gradually need to be addressed, probably through cardiovascular reconditioning, some aspects of physiotherapy, and aspects of neural therapy that I'm going to explain later on in this video. So what happens in the case of muscle atrophy when our body becomes deconditioned and we don't use these muscles for an extended period of time? Well, it only takes 6 to 10 days for a muscle to lose half of its ability to perform useful work. In the next 6 to 10 days, half of what is left is lost, and so forth, until around 30 days. and then up to 90% of a muscle's functional capacity can be lost at that point. So as you guys may be aware, muscles perform various different tasks throughout a day to allow the human body to actually function optimally. This can be sending signals from the muscular components and physical activity up to sensors in the brain to allow proper homeostatic functions. This could be to move our limbs throughout space. This could be to resist the stresses of gravity upon our body. It's so fundamentally important that we have these functions within our muscles, and they're very stable and they resist these stresses that we face. And adding on that point, muscular imbalances and joint instability between the right and left hand side of the body can also lead to a situation known as deafferentation, where inaccurate signaling from joint mechanoreceptors to areas of the brain causes chemical imbalances. This can contribute to spinal misalignment, pain, immune conditions, and autonomic syndromes. And in case you weren't aware, there's a huge link between muscles and sections of the brain. And if there's imbalance in either of these things, it's going to affect the other one. And that's why deafferentation from muscles to the brain can lead to so many issues. I'm going to explain a lot about that topic on the next video I put out on this channel. But building on from the importance of muscles, slow twitch muscles are aerobic and possess a high degree of endurance character. They function to resist gravity. They are generally extensor or postural shunt muscles. As a consequence of a decreased level of joint mechanoreceptor stimulation, aerobic muscles adapt to become more like anaerobic muscles. They lose their mitochondrial electron acceptors, and they have a diminished ability to aerobically produce ATP. Now, not only does the total number of ATP molecules drop from 36 to 2, but the ATP production must be shifted from aerobic to anaerobic pathways, leading to an overall decrease in the production of energy. Anaerobic pathways also lead to an increased production of lactic acid, which is a well-known tissue irritant. So you could really start to make this link now between deconditioning, the loss of muscle tone, and symptoms like orthostatic intolerance, so the inability to deal with the stresses of gravity, especially when you start to lose some of that muscle tone when it comes to those postural shunt muscles and those slow twitch muscle fibers. And then one phenomenon that can come about as a result of loss of muscle tone and deconditioning is deafferentation, which is basically the signaling from muscles up to areas of the brain. And deafferentation can drive muscles away from sodium equilibrium potential, which is the excitation of muscles, and towards potassium equilibrium potential, which is the inhibition of muscles. This change in activation can result in muscle spasm, changes to muscle tone, and a decreased level of joint mechanoreceptor stimulation. And what may end up happening is you may end up with changes in muscle tone between the right hand side and the left hand side of your body, and that may actually deliver abnormal signals up to the area of your brain, the cortex, the big hemisphere part. And if you guys have checked out my functional neurology series, you'll know that the cortex actually inhibits activity of the midbrain and the hypothalamus. So that's a part of the brain that's really involved with the stimulation of certain immune suppressing hormones and stress hormones. So we want that signaling to be correct. And if it isn't, we can start to understand how that could link to certain CFS symptoms. So deconditioning and muscle atrophy alone can create extreme fatigue and 18 times less expendable energy because of that switch from aerobic to anaerobic energy production in muscles. Muscle and joint ache and pain because of increased lactic acid production. Orthostatic intolerance because of that loss of slow twitch muscle fibers, especially the anti-gravity and postural muscles in and around the spinal cord. And also spinal instabilities and abnormal posture because of the loss of postural muscle tone. So that brings us on to the CFS cycle, which is a bunch of situations that can occur back to back, which I believe puts an individual in a situation of chronic fatigue where they're bedbound and they can't really escape the situation they're currently in. So we start with the trigger, which is some sort of unexpected physical, chemical, or psychological trauma to the body, i.e. a viral, immune dysfunction, concussion, emotional trauma, or some sort of adverse reaction to a form of medication. And this causes an upregulation in areas of the midbrain, and the body becomes on high alert. And in turn, that upregulates the stress response and downregulates the immune system, leading to an increased cortisol secretion. And increased cortisol secretions cause muscle and joint breakdown and transitions tissues and muscles away from sodium equilibrium potential and towards potassium equilibrium potential. So away from muscle excitation and towards muscle inhibition. And as a result, muscles adapt towards anaerobic metabolism, which causes 18 times less energy production. And endurance muscles are heavily impacted, as they are the muscles that are the richest in mitochondria. And because of anaerobic energy production, there's an increase in lactic acid production in these muscles, which contributes to chronic fatigue, orthostatic intolerance, joint pain, and ultimately over time, deconditioning. And now, because of deconditioning and the loss of muscle tone, everyday movements now bring with them further deafferentation from those muscles towards centers in the brain, and this is via joint mechanoreceptors. And ultimately, this incorrect neuronal signaling to the brain prevents the cortex from inhibiting the ipsilateral, so the same side hypothalamus, resulting in chronic upregulation of the stress response, pain, immune problems, autonomic dysfunction, and postural instabilities. And the thing we really need to understand about this cycle is the fact that even if somebody has a chronic illness already, some inflammatory disorder, an immune disorder, whatever it may be, they may even suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome already, it doesn't prevent them, it doesn't stop them from experiencing multiple traumas. And then one trauma gets added to another and then to another, and the cycle repeats itself. And suddenly, instead of the individual being able to resist certain forms of stress, now their body is continuously having to adapt to it. And this is where we see that loss of muscle tone, we see that orthostatic intolerance, we see that general fatigue, we see lots of these weakened immune systems and people picking up colds and flus and just feeling like they have a low resistance to the overall stresses of day-to-day life. So now that brings me on to my final thoughts. Now, whether it's a case of deconditioning, a concussion, viral, bacterial, or autoimmune related, it seems that chronic fatigue syndrome has some sort of central nervous system component to it involving the spinal cord and brain. Deafferentation, which is incorrect or inaccurate signaling from joint mechanoreceptors to the brain, can then cause a lack of inhibition for the cortex to the same side hypothalamus, and that can create a vicious cycle which brings about pain, fatigue, muscular imbalances, immune disorders, hormonal changes, and ultimately autonomic dysfunction. It's also worth noting that when signaling up from these joint mechanoreceptors to the brain becomes inaccurate, the brain can become fatigued and it can also become hypersensitive to its environment. So it's important not to ignore this when approaching recovery, and that may hint us towards certain areas of the brain that require stimulation and others that require inhibition. And personally, I believe activities that promote neuroplasticity and rebalancing of the neuraxis via functional neurologic rehab and gradual cardiovascular reconditioning through aerobic training might be the best approach to take. Although I must stress that it is important to be properly assessed and take recovery very gradually. But yeah, I think there's lots of things we need to consider when it comes to CFS recovery. And I think one thing that's really important to note is the fact that lots of CFS sufferers have ended up developing the condition from multiple different avenues. So we can't just look towards supplementing something and hope it makes us better. It may not be a deficiency of something. It may just be the fact that our bodies aren't being utilized properly. Something in the brain has been hindered. It hasn't been accessed properly. It's got inaccurate firing to it, and it's just not performing as it normally would do to try to protect us best from our environment and allow us to actually progress with our lives. And I think these are the things we really need to target with cardiovascular reconditioning to retrain the body, but also that neural retraining through functional neurology to train areas of the brain to try to balance out the nervous system